There is a feeling of frustration that hangs limply in Iraq. Abu Noor, a businessman in his mid-40s, spoke to me about procurement in the country while driving us through the commerce district of Najaf. He stuck a hand out of the window and explained that a tender will become available to construct a new public building with a value of, for instance, 2 billion dinars, equivalent to about £1 million. This will be awarded to someone based on their connection with the public officials in charge of the deal. The contractor will award this contract for, say, 1.5 billion dinars, gaining a fast $500 million dinars in the process. Rather than construct the building, the contractor will become a tenderer and simply repeat the offer, transferring the project to someone else for, say, 1.3 million dinars. The process continues until some poor contractor ends up doing the job for a couple of 100,000 dinars. The public building ends up being constructed to a minimum standard, with half a dozen people pocketing millions of dinars of Iraqi public money in the process. In Baghdad, Ziad, a civil servant working in the Ministry of Labour, explains another mechanism for personal enrichment. He told me that contracts are regularly awarded for values just below the threshold for public scrutiny. For example, a contract for desks is awarded for 49 million dinars, in the knowledge that contracts for 50 million dinars must be published. This will be a single-source contract, given on the basis of family ties or a guarantee that the person issuing the tender will receive a generous backhander. Ziad had no evidence for this, aside from the accounts of his colleagues, who said they knew this was happening. People were keen to give me examples of corruption at lower levels of public authority too. Bashir is a father of 2 young girls that lives in the south and works doing odd jobs. He told me how he was stopped at a checkpoint the week before. The traffic officer told him that he had not been wearing his seatbelt and would have to pay a 35,000 dinar fine, amounting to about £20. Bashir told me he decided to try his luck. He looked at the officer and said, "Brother, why take 35,000 when 8,000 dinars will buy your breakfast?" The officer smiled, accepted the 8,000 and let Bashir continue his journey. It was not all depressing though. On the day before I left, I heard a promising story of someone fighting corruption at the lowest level. A woman had been telling me about how students give university professors small bribes to secure their grades when she was interrupted by Safa, her 10-year-old daughter. Safa enthusiastically told us how her teacher had told one of her friends in front of the entire class, "Tell your mother to stop sending me phone cards." Rather than being surprised by this parent's desperate act, Safa was simply proud of a teacher that would give her an equal chance as someone who had been offering a reward for better grades. I spent 2 weeks visiting governorates, from Najaf in the south to Dahuk in the north, to ask Iraqis about their views on corruption and conduct research on post-conflict stabilisation. My findings have their limitations. There are fewer women in public spaces such as shops, restaurants, hotels and coffee bars. When I did approach women, most either shrugged and said they weren't informed enough to know, or else told me that they needed permission from their husbands before responding to my questions. As a result, women's opinions are underrepresented in my more formal surveys. I tried to overcome this by having informal conversations with Iraqi women in places where they felt more confident as being part of their territory, places like mosques and kitchens. Though the language and tone of the responses was far less formal than those with men, I still gathered some useful information on corruption and revolution in Iraq. Another important limitation of my research, which should be mentioned, is my inability to verify most of the stories which people gave me, or ask public civil servants to defend themselves. In some respects, this doesn't really matter. My frustrated efforts to check these anecdotes is in itself an indication of the lack of transparency and accountability in Iraqi public office. Moreover, in the political market, just like in the economic market, perceptions can be just as important as reality. Self-fulfilling prophecies are an important notion in the Arab world. Most analysts agree at a minimum that a rise in expectations was instrumental in the Arab Spring. In Iraq, expectations of politicians are rock bottom. Not one person that I spoke to anticipated a significant decline in Iraqi political corruption in the near future. Pessimism is in abundant supply across the south and central regions of the country. In the north, where security is as stable as the burgeoning new constructions, confidence in the Kurdistan regional government is stronger. Most people clearly articulated faith in either the KDP or the PUK, the region's 2 main parties, and most claimed that it was the lack of corruption rather than the wealth of these parties that had accelerated the north's economic development far beyond areas under the control of Iraq's central government. Aside from this geographical unevenness, corruption is considered rife vertically, and I was given examples of corruption in all levels of Iraqi society. History has an important role to play in these perceptions. I met members of Iraq's older generation who remember what came before Saddam Hussein's 24-year presidency. They enthusiastically dug up old photos that brought surprise and laughter, but also sadness. In some ways, these old images of Iraq are more colourful and bright than the insipid pictures of Iraq today. For most, though, Saddam Hussein's rule is fresh in mind almost 10 years on, and has dramatically influenced Iraqis' expectations. If, however, the demands of Arabs today are no more than to have something better than the Husseins, Gaddafis and Assads, then the future of the region looks bleak. Academic interest in corruption in the region is actually a relatively accurate reflection of public interest. In academic papers, just as in kitchen conversations, corruption is cited as a factor which is holding them or us back, whether it's inhibiting economic growth, political development or freedom. But it's simply mentioned, noted, cited or listed as one of many other frustrations. Corruption is all too often considered impenetrable by analysis and impenetrable by action. This is why I wanted to focus on corruption in my paper for the conference this June with the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies and LSE's Middle East Centre. I believe that Iraqi perceptions about corruption and its inevitability have influenced their expectations, Iraqi human rights discourse, and perhaps most importantly, mechanisms of protest. At the conference, I'll be exploring this relationship between corruption and protest in Iraq and contrasting it to the case of Bahrain. I hope this will help me to understand why Abu Noor, Ziyad, Bashir and Safa have stayed in their homes while their Bahraini counterparts have taken to the streets to protest injustice. I believe corruption is important in understanding change and continuity in Iraq and in the Middle East.